Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kalira. I'm a dietetics student at Mount Saint Vincent University. So it's great pleasure to be here today to be able to introduce the next speaker. So Jennifer Brady is a registered dietitian and an assistant professor in the Department of Applied Human Nutrition at Mount Saint Vincent University. Her work uses qualitative research methods like interviewing to explore how health professionals can play a role in advancing social justice. Jennifer is also a regular contributor to CBC's Information Morning. And also Paul Taylor is an executive director of FoodShare Toronto and a lifelong anti-poverty activist. He also teaches at Simon Fraser University and is a regular political commentator on CTV and has written numerous op-eds and columns on various social issues. Growing up materially poor in Toronto has inspired Paul to commit his life to doing what he can to dismantle the systems and harmful organizing principles that can cause and uphold poverty, food insecurity, and wealth inequality, including racism, white supremacy, and neoliberalism. In 2020, Paul was named one of Canada's top 40 under 40, one of Toronto's Life's 50 most influential Torontarians, and voted as best activist by Now magazine readers.
Perfect. Thank you, Mandy. I do. Yes, thank you. So before I even get started, I'm going to digress. I just want to offer a couple of points to build on some of the presentations that we've seen already this morning. So, of course, when we're doing advocacy, talking to politicians is very important. But as a health professional, I would also suggest that we talk to those folks. They, as we all know, have a particular voice and authority in society. And of course, food insecurity and poverty, as well as all of the other issues that those two things intersect with, racism, homophobia, transphobia, colonialism, all impact on people's health. And health professionals need to have an understanding of that and need to use the authority that they have, not just to help us with our health and our bodies, our physiology, but they need to, in my opinion, do more to address the structural issues that bring us to their clinics. So as you're thinking about talking to politicians that might knock on your door or that have maybe recently been elected in Nova Scotia, talk to your doctor when you go. Like, you can just mention basic income. A lot of those folks don't necessarily know about structural issues, because I can tell you, as someone who does research on health professions and the way that they get educated, there's very little education that they usually receive on the ways that structural issues impact people's health. So it's, you can put the bug in their ear. The other thing that I just want to mention in response to something that Sheila said, we've absolutely been talking about so many issues that we're still talking about today, like the ones that Sheila mentioned, racism, housing, et cetera, but we've also been talking about food insecurity since that time. And I'm going to speak to you about what's called individual and household food insecurity. So that's food insecurity at the sort of individual level. It's experienced by individuals or experienced within households. There's a whole other conceptualization or way of understanding food insecurity that's called community food insecurity. Now, I'm not going to really address that, but that's the point that I want to make, that we have been talking about since the 70s. So if anyone knows the book by Frances Moore Lappé, might ring some bells, Diet for a Small Planet, that came out in the early 70s, and she was very much addressing food systems and the problem with food systems and the way that they contribute to climate change. And basic income also has an important way that it speaks to community food systems within our cities, but also within the province, within our country, but also globally. I mean, we operate now with a globalized food system that does a ton of damage to our environment and to our lives in so many different ways. And that's an old conversation. I'm not saying anything new in saying that, unfortunately. So that's my digression. So I'll get on to what I was actually planning on talking about. So I'm hoping to lay some groundwork around food insecurity, what that is, what that looks like, and how it connects to basic income. Oh, sorry, one more digression. So, this book was mentioned earlier this morning, it's actually quite a privilege to draw your attention to it because Elaine Power was my PhD supervisor, and beyond being a committed advocate, a brilliant person, she is just one of the kindest, warmest, loveliest people I know, and so if that doesn't motivate you to go buy her book and find out more about basic income, maybe just the information contained that will build on many of the things you're hearing about today will. So it is available online, of course, as pretty much everything is these days, but it's also available at the Bookmark bookstore, which is a local bookstore just around the corner. Okay, so I first wanted to address the question of what is food insecurity? What am I even talking about here? Because it really, I wanted to share this, or start here, because it, I think, offers, or allows us to start on the same page in understanding what I mean when I say food insecurity, but it also highlights the way that this is very much an income issue. Food insecurity is not a food issue. It is an income issue. It's an income, a structural inequality issue with respect to income. And that is actually part of its very definition. Food insecurity is simply a symptom. It's not the problem. It's a symptom of poverty. And the definition, as well as the data, the chart on the far side of the slide there, underscores that. So the definition that we use in Canada in terms of understanding and then measuring food insecurity, and I'm going to show you some of that measurement data in just a moment, is this. So food insecurity is the inadequate or insecure access to adequate food due to financial constraints. Due to financial constraints. It has, it's essentially saying poverty in there. Food insecurity is the result of poverty. And we can see that in the data on the far side of the slide there. Not surprisingly, food insecurity decreases as people's income increases. Now, I just want to point out that you'll see food insecurity doesn't completely go away, even at the higher ends of income earnings. And even the sort of $80,000 mark is well beyond what many people in Nova Scotia are earning. But even at that income level, food insecurity doesn't disappear. And that, to me, is an argument for why, when we're thinking about anti-poverty solutions to solve food insecurity, like basic income, we can't at the same time then be dismissing the way that we need other services. So it is a very much an income issue, but it's not only an income issue. Income, of course, intersects with other issues like addictions, domestic violence, et cetera. And so basic income very much needs to complement those other social services. And to me, that data makes that argument. Oh, and I should also just say, if anything I say is unclear, or if I can say more to clarify a point, please just stop me. I'm happy to take questions in the middle of this. So a little bit more about what food insecurity is. That data shows you that it's very much tied to poverty, but there's kind of more to the story that adds a little bit of nuance or a little bit of more detail to unpack what the issue is. So food insecurity, first, is not the same thing as being hungry. It's not the same thing as being hungry due to lack of sufficient amount of food or quality of food. And that actually is one of the key differences between how we understand what the problem is today versus how we understood it back in the 70s. So back in the 70s, the sort of dialogue or the way that we conceptualized this problem was through hunger. And that's actually quite an important difference to understanding it as food insecurity. And the reason for that is because at the point of hunger, someone, an individual or a household, has already compromised many things, paying for many things in their lives or in their households well before they've become hungry. So for example, I've got the point down there somewhere. Bills, basic expenses of the household, medications obviously are sacrificed or are regularly sacrificed. Other basic needs of a household, electric bills, heat, transportation, means of communication, those bills often go unpaid for months or longer before someone will compromise the amount of food before they're actually hungry. So food insecurity actually allows us to conceptualize the ways that compromising someone's, the quantity, the amount of food that they eat or the quality of food is really sort of a really severe point of not having enough money or not having enough food. So there's so many things that are going wrong or are inaccessible long before someone's actually hungry. Food insecurity also names the way that people will compromise the lack of the quality of their food before they experience hunger. And that's an important point because, of course, the way that food insecurity is interconnected to health and not having a sufficient quality of food or a healthy diet is obviously going to have health impacts, whether someone's hungry or not. So food insecurity, that's, again, an important distinction. Food insecurity may also be long-term or episodic. It can be, short-term crises in a household. That could be the loss of a job, a global pandemic, which is not so episodic these days, or is not feeling episodic. It's actually feeling quite chronic and long-term. Or it could be, those expenses that come up, those emergency expenses like the brakes on your cargo. You break your glasses, you lose your keys and have to replace, apartment buildings make you replace the locks, and that's not cheap. So it can be those unexpected expenses that we all experience in life, but when you're living on the edge of poverty, that really can set you back, and it can be a setback that you don't, that can be really difficult and sometimes impossible to claw your way back out of. The other thing with food insecurity, yeah, Amy. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of different answers to that question. Yes, food insecurity does, the way that we define it allows us to then measure the ways that a household would compromise the quality, the nutritional quality, or the healthfulness of the food that a household's eating or individuals in the household are eating. But the definition still really hinges on income. So I'm going to show you in a minute the ways that food insecurity is also broken down by severity or how badly someone is without food. So there is a little bit of that, but it's still, like I said, it still really hinges on income. So it's not a perfect definition, but yes, there's a whole other concept around nutrition security or nutritional justice, which I think gets at Amy's point. So the other important thing about food insecurity that adds a little bit more complexity or detail to the definition I gave you earlier is that food insecurity is often experienced differently by different people in the same household. So for example, adults, particularly adult women and older children, usually are more food insecure than the younger children. So even within a household, you can have different levels of food insecurity among the people living in that household. And like I said, often other bills are long delayed before someone would actually experience hunger. Oh, and of course, it doesn't come just with hunger or nutritional compromise or a sort of eating less healthy foods, but there's obviously a significant degree of stigmatization, social isolation, and marginalization. And it goes to things that we often see as the extras of food and eating, but the ways that food is so interconnected to our social lives, our spiritual selves, our cultural heritage, and just dignity as humans, it's also important to understand that food insecurity and the threats to those things are happening long before someone is hungry. or like physically hungry. You know, I think about like yesterday, a couple of us went out for coffee, and I paid for coffee. Just kidding, Mandy. But you know, that's something that you can do when you have a little bit of extra money, and it's a pleasure to say, I'll get coffee. And those small day-to-day things are the things that, you know, are nice to treat your friends, nice to treat your family, to a couple bucks for coffee. But those are things that are not accessible to people. And same with food. You know, it's nice to have someone over for Thanksgiving dinner. It's nice to have Thanksgiving dinner, let alone have friends or family over, and that those social experiences just aren't accessible for someone experiencing food insecurity. All right, so if it's not obvious, I just wanted to raise a few key points of why we should be concerned about food insecurity in Nova Scotia. This was mentioned earlier, and I think maybe the data that you cited was a little bit more recent, because I think I took this from a 2015 report, but poverty costs us $2.4 billion alone. That's just alone in Nova Scotia. That's just in Nova Scotia. Even if we took half of that money, that $1 billion, that is more than enough to feed people in Nova Scotia. So it just does not make sense, the system that we currently have. And I'm going to talk briefly about the system that we do currently have and why it's not working. Food insecurity results in social, it's referred to, this is sort of in the research speak, social and material deprivation. What does that mean? People are materially deprived, they don't have enough food to eat, basically, is what that means, but also socially deprived, and that's what I mentioned just moments ago around, you know, having family meals, having friends or family over for dinner, or not being embarrassed when someone comes to your house and your cupboards are empty. And that experience of that stigma and embarrassment actually is been shown in the literature to be prevalent, which maybe isn't surprising, but I do think that it's shocking that we know that and still haven't really addressed food insecurity. Of course, reduced quantity and quality of life for those experiencing food insecurity. So food insecurity, because it is so closely tied to poverty, is a very good proxy measure for poverty. So even though I'm not talking about poverty specifically here, or this data isn't showing poverty specifically in this data, essentially it's an indicator of material deprivation or poverty. So you can see in the slide at the far right there that does this have a pointer? No, that's okay. So you can see the further you go across the slide, the more severe levels of food insecurity. So we move from food secure, closest to me, and then marginally food insecure, moderately, and severely. And so that's increasing severity of food insecurity. And you can see quite clearly that for death, or what's otherwise called all-cause mortality, so any reason that someone might die, non-communicable diseases, so that would be things like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, so chronic diseases, obviously are quite clearly are experienced more so with increasing severity of food insecurity. The interesting thing too is so are communicable diseases. COVID-19, for example, the data has shown us quite clearly that among lower income communities or communities living in poverty, COVID-19 also struck those communities the hardest. So food insecurity as an indicator of poverty also tells us that food insecure households are more likely to contract but also suffer severe illness from even communicable diseases. Of course, reduced length of life and disease-free years. There's a lot of data, and there was a report that came out recently showing that university students who experience food insecurity are half as likely to graduate from their university programs. And then, again, the stuff that we often see as the extras of life, which I would suggest really aren't extras, but are actually integral to our day-to-day life and just our sense of self and sense of personhood as humans. And food plays such a role in all of these things. So what does food insecurity look like in Canada? We'll start nationally. The most recent data we have suggests that 4.4 million Canadians are food insecure. That amounts to about 1.8 million households, which includes 1.2 million children across Canada. And that data is the highest prevalence of food insecurity that Canada has had, and this is pre-COVID. And so COVID has skyrocketed those numbers. But even those pre-COVID numbers are the highest they've ever been since we first started measuring food insecurity in Canada in 2005. Now, I mentioned the way that we measure food insecurity allows us also to break down the degrees of severity. So of that 4.4 million, about 3% of that group of people would be considered severely food insecure. So those are households that are experiencing a lack of quantity. So they're actually cutting meals, sometimes eating not at all or eating one meal a day because they're so severely food insecure. The vast majority are what's called moderately food insecure. So there's definitely lower quality of food, sometimes lower quantity of food, but not quite as severe. And then the marginally food insecure, that would include that 4% group, that would include things like everything from just worrying about where your next meal might come from to actually compromising the quality of the food that you're eating. So across Canada, we know, of course, rates of food insecurity. Oh, am I going super duper long? Thank you. So rates of food insecurity are not equally distributed across Canada. The North, in particular, experiences quite high rates, and that's always been the case. But one thing that's important is that Nova Scotia, among all the provinces, has historically been the most food insecure province. And you can see that they're 15.3%. Right there. Now, that, of course, doesn't apply equally to everybody, so we know rates of food insecurity break down unequally among equity-seeking groups, or what is sometimes called marginalized people, marginalized folks in Canada. So couples with children are particularly vulnerable to food insecurity, so there's something about having children, the high cost of having children, and the inability for employment, et cetera, that makes households more vulnerable to food insecurity. But again, gender plays a role in that. So female-led lone parent households are among the most food insecure households in Canada. So of that 1.8 million households, the vast majority of them are female lone parent led households. Also breaks down with respect to race and racism and colonialism. So we know that white folks, for example, experience lower rates of food insecurity within that 4.4 million Canadians that experience food insecurity. So Black folks and Indigenous folks are definitely disproportionately represented. I mentioned in the North that food insecurity is particularly high, and you can see here in this chart, Nunavut in particular experiences astronomical rates of food insecurity, and this is definitely pre-COVID numbers. You can see that not only is the prevalence higher in the North, but also the severity. So it's not just that more people are food insecure, but those that are food insecure are more deeply food insecure. So what are we doing about this right now in Nova Scotia and in Canada? Right now, the primary way we address food insecurity is food banks, or what is sometimes referred to as food charity or charity models. So there's a number of different problems with that I want to point out. First of all, food banks aren't even used by the vast majority of households that are experiencing food insecurity. So this chart here shows you the difference between the numbers of those living in food insecure households versus those who actually use food banks. Now, why can we see such a huge contrast between those who are food insecure, who we think, oh, well, you can get food from a food bank, versus those who actually go and use the food bank? First of all, food banks have an unpredictable and insufficient supply of food. So you can go to the food bank, but you're not guaranteed to get enough food to feed your family or yourself. You're also not guaranteed to get food that accommodates your dietary needs. Could be allergies, could be, we had gluten-free lunch, for example. That doesn't show up in the food bank. It's stigmatizing to go and use a food bank. It also is just simply a Band-Aid solution to really what is the root problem, is a lack of money, not a lack of food. So it's really about poverty, and the food bank does not address that. It also just simply denies people their basic human right to food. So nothing about food banks, in my opinion, actually works. Another way that we address food insecurity is through social assistance. And again, there's a number of problems with that. First of all, social assistance is grossly inadequate to afford even the most basic healthy diet. So I'm not talking about salmon and quinoa, I'm talking about just a sufficient quantity of healthy foods. It also adds huge barriers for anyone that has special dietary needs. So if you have celiac disease, you can get a small amount of additional money, but there's so many barriers to actually accessing that money. And I'll show you a chart of that in just a second. So you can see here in this data, the column that's closest to me gives you the amount of money a household would be left with if they're living on social assistance based on a number of different reference households. Yeah, Kendall?
When you talk about social assistance here in Nova Scotia, have you actually, through your work of being a dietitian, ever had the opportunity to study section 6.3.3 of the Income Assistance Policy Manual? And the reason I'm asking that question is because that part of the policy manual actually structures what type of medical note from a doctor or dietitian caseworker is allowed to accept in order to approve you for certain special diets, what special diets are available. Like it's a three-category chart where the name of the special diet, the allotted amount, and what, according to community services, the special diet is for. And there's belief among the people who I used to advocate for in Nova Scotia Advocate that when that part of the policy was made by a higher-up bureaucrat that worked over the heads of income assistance caseworkers, there was no doctors or dietitians involved. But anyway, I'm just wondering if you've ever looked at that part of the policy and what your opinions are on it.
Yeah, I have looked at that. So what Kendall's referring to is called the Special Diet Schedule. So it's a sort of an appendix to the rates for social assistance, whereby if you have a special condition, if you have a disease, a chronic disease, which would include celiac disease, HIV, cancer, and other diseases, you can seek additional funding through your social assistance from your caseworker. Now, you can't just walk in there and say, I have celiac disease, I need more social assistance to be able to afford gluten-free foods, which we know are more expensive. You have to get a note from a doctor or a dietitian, and that is something that I do. I volunteer at a clinic, giving those notes to folks to take to their caseworkers. My opinion of that is that it's inhumane, it's undignified, it's gross and wrong, and it's really hard to get into a dietitian, actually. Oftentimes, you can't get into a dietitian, like a publicly funded dietitian through our healthcare system, so to seek a dietitian, you might have to pay for that, which obviously would be out of reach for many people if you're living on social assistance. So I write those notes for people when I volunteer at the clinic, and I have to go through with this person and gather evidence for why they deserve a little bit more money. Okay, let me move on because I'm getting the time signal. My apologies. So how might we address how might we address food insecurity? Living wage has been put forward, which I would argue is very important, and that's about $22 in Nova Scotia. It's important, but it's insufficient. Because food insecurity, we know many people who are food insecure, actually employment is their main source of income. So it's not about employment, it's not just about a living wage, it's about the precarity of that employment. So for people who are working at Tim Hortons or they're working hourly jobs that, if they call in sick, they don't get paid, or they can be fired quite easily. So food insecurity is about poverty and lack of employment in some cases, but it's more so about the precarity of that employment. It also doesn't in any way appreciate or rethink or help us better conceptualize how we think of work. So work right now is just paid employment. It doesn't include things like volunteerism or childcare, elder care, etc. So how might we address food insecurity in Nova Scotia? I would say social policy that addresses poverty as the root cause of food insecurity, and we've seen that in Newfoundland implemented a suite of social policy changes to restructure social assistance. And not surprisingly, because it gave people on social assistance more money, food insecurity dropped. And I'm not going to go over it just for time reasons, all of the policies that they implemented, but you can see the green line there, food insecurity decreased significantly. And again, this is the same data, but with comparison to the other provinces. So we saw that with that suite of policies, Newfoundland's rate of food insecurity decreased significantly, where food insecurity stayed the same across the other provinces. Finally, this is my last slide, I promise, Mandy. Why is basic income an effective policy option to reduce food insecurity compared to the ones that I've just shown you? Of course, all of the pilot data and the targeted income programs that we currently have, such as old age security, child tax benefit, work. It addresses really what is the root cause of food insecurity, which is poverty, not a lack of food. Of course, there's short-term costs, but the long-term savings are significant. That number that I showed you earlier, that $2.4 billion that we spend, addressing the problems that poverty causes would essentially be our savings, or a vast majority of it would be savings, and complements other essential components of a robust social safety net, such as housing, healthcare, and pharmacare. Also restores dignity, equity, and a sense of autonomy over what is really a basic human right, so that from the small things like paying for coffee for a friend, to being able to have friends over for dinner, to being able to follow spiritual, religious, dietary practices. And I'll end there. Thank you so much. No, it's good, it's good. I'm sorry for...
That was a lovely talk. I really appreciate it, Jen. And you provided so much good information about both what food security is and the impact it has, and how our current solutions are not solutions at all. So I really appreciate that. And now, can we welcome Paul Taylor? And I'm going to put your...
I have no slides, so this is perfect. It's nice and colorful. And I'm so glad that Jen went before me, because you get to talk about all the things that I get to tell stories. And you have oriented folks in terms of food insecurity. It's great to be here. Thank you so much. And as an occupational hazard, I will go on and yammer on. You'll see this when you ask me questions. So for your sake and for mine, I've prepared a few remarks. But yes, thank you so much for having me, and thank you again, Jen, for that coffee yesterday. It was really good, and I appreciate your generosity. I just want to make sure I say thank you more times maybe than Mandy does. It's a real pleasure to be here, and today I'm going to be talking about food insecurity, and I think we can't talk about food insecurity unless we really have a conversation about racism. There are many things we could be talking about in connection with food insecurity. Racism, patriarchy. I'm going to focus in on racism today. And then, of course, while we're all here, basic income, and I'll share some of my thoughts on basic income and how it can work to tackle food insecurity. So I hope that you receive my words in a good way and with an open heart. Before I start, I want to let you in on a little secret. This is actually my first trip east in all of the years that I've lived on this land, so it's extra special for me, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here with you on the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. I myself was born and raised on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I live and work and play on those lands. But actually, I'm going to go in a bit of a different direction, and it starts with a different kind of bio that's really important to me, and to keep close to me as I orient myself in the work and the activism that I'm involved in. So as was mentioned earlier, I'm Paul Taylor, but it's important for me to acknowledge that I'm also the son of Bernadine Taylor, the grandson of Maisie Baker-Burt, and the great-grandson of Rebecca Thompson. I acknowledge these women because I'm here and able to do the work that I do because of many of the gifts and the hard work and the sacrifices and the gifts from many of these women and many others that came before me, especially the Black women that came before me and those that have helped me along my journey. And I think it's so important for me, and I think should be important for all of us actually, to celebrate and recognize Black women. Their labor has been critical to many of our communities, but it often goes unrecognized and uncelebrated. In so many ways, when I think about these women, my family, Black women that came before me, these women are me and I am them. It's through the stories that I've heard about my great-grandmother, Rebecca Thompson, that I've been taught about the importance of being bold, about dreaming in color, and to stand firmly for what I believe in. Now, my grandmother, Maisie, despite not having a lot, used to feed as many local children in the community as she could. She grew up on a small island called St. Kitts in the Caribbean. And what she taught me through that is she taught me about my responsibility to community. She taught me about how important it was to use the little that we have, be it food, knowledge, or power, for the betterment of our community. My mom, Bernadine, taught me that I could be anything that I wanted to be. She taught me that anything was possible, and that as a black boy, I should never let myself be defined by society's low expectations of me. And then from the black women that my mother considered her closest friends, I learned about mutual aid and what it means to show up for my community when the systems around us neglect to do so. Again, that's who I am. All of these women are me. They've inspired a desire for change, a desire for justice that will live on in me until it's achieved. I think a lot about food. I love food, cooking it, growing it, eating it, and if I'm honest, sometimes even playing with it. I want you to close your eyes for a moment. I've never done this before, but I want you all to close your eyes for a moment. And I want you to imagine a land where we all have the food that we need. Food insecurity doesn't exist. Poverty doesn't exist. Homelessness doesn't exist. That place that you're imagining, that can be this place. It shouldn't be so hard for us to imagine it. We can open our eyes now. It shouldn't be so hard for us to imagine it. In fact, we shouldn't have to imagine it at all. We all deserve to eat. In fact, Canada, one of the things that I like to center these kinds of conversations on is that Canada ratified something called the right to food. It was introduced in 1966 and then ratified by the federal government in 1976. It exists as part of our economic, cultural, and social rights that are outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Canada signed on to this international law, and our government is bound by it. When I say the right to food, it should be clear. It's not to be confused with, I think, the way that it's often been interpreted. The right to leftover food, the right to corporate waste, the right to all kinds of other things. The right to food in Canada outlines that it's the government's duty to ensure that we can all feed ourselves, our families, and our communities with dignity. It should mean that food insecurity isn't a thing in Canada. But unfortunately, it seems that our governments have interpreted the right to food as a kind of a sort of right. You know, it's only applicable to those that can afford it, and this is part of the problem. We've made something that is a right also a commodity. Food is a commodity. We're not talking about access to the most expensive bottle of champagne or Porsche. We're talking about food. Food shouldn't be a luxury because food is a right. And in fact, I think it's also important to note, for many Indigenous peoples, food being a right didn't come from a government proclamation or some law or the signing of some document by a bunch of white men in suits. The right to access land, water, and food is an ancestral right. And I think it's really important to acknowledge, as we think about rights-based arguments against food insecurity, that rights aren't just given to us by lawmakers, but for many, the right to food goes far beyond a legal framework. Despite the fact that the right to food exists in Canada, as Jen pointed out, there are over 4.4 million people that are food insecure and struggle to access the food that they need. That's 4.4 million people. I think it's almost, the cities of Toronto and Montreal combined. This is a huge crisis. It's also an underestimation when we talk about that 4.4 million. Those numbers from Statistics Canada don't include First Nations, Inuit, or Métis folks living on reserves or people that are houseless. So it is a gross underestimate. And as Jen mentioned, 4.4 million is also a pre-pandemic figure. For some reason, we stopped tracking food insecurity in the way that we did in the middle of the pandemic. So it's really hard to identify the impact that the pandemic has had on levels of food insecurity. We have seen some data that we could infer that food insecurity has increased north of 5.5 million as a result of the pandemic. And this was in about May of 2020, I believe. So it's Before the pandemic, it's a huge thing. It was unequivocal crisis. And in a country as wealthy as Canada, a place that's often heralded for our good quality of life, how can we have more people food insecure that are the populations of, like I said, Montreal and Toronto combined? How could this possibly be the case in a country that ratified the right to food? How can this be the case in a country that has more than enough food to feed all of the people that live on this land? Well, there are a number of reasons, and I think one of the big ones is government neglect and the absolute failure of our governments to respect, protect, and fulfill the right to food. They are responsible for creating the conditions that allow us to feed ourselves, and they have failed us at that for a long time. And I think I really appreciate all of the slides Jen shared, but one especially, where she highlighted, where people get their income from, because I think there's a misconception that most people that are food insecure are on social assistance. Well, in fact, the reality is, as Jen's slide pointed out, 65% of people that are food insecure derive their income from employment. So they are getting paid, and they're getting paid an amount that isn't enough for them to access the food that they need. And this brings us to, I think the first failure on the right to food. When we look at provincial governments, minimum wages are set, and they're not set at livable amounts. So we know our elected officials, when they identify what the living wage is going to be, they know that they are legislating people to live in poverty, people who are working to live in poverty and to likely be food insecure. And this is a policy choice, a choice to legislate low-income workers into poverty and food insecurity. What we need to remember is that because it's a choice, it can also be changed. And I think one of the things that scares me a lot when I have these sorts of conversations with people is people sometimes think poverty and food insecurity across this land is inevitable. It is not inevitable. We can overcome and not have poverty or food insecurity in this country. Thank you, Mandy. I think, so I'm from Toronto, born and raised in Toronto. I apologize for that later, maybe. In Toronto, 13% of the population lives in a food insecure household. I've heard that figure cited a lot. We go to these food security things. It's often the same kind of folks. Jen and I talked about this yesterday. And we hear similar statistics cited over and over again. 13% of Torontonians live in food insecure households. What I don't hear as often is the fact that that number jumps to 27% when it comes to folks living in racialized households, especially those that identify as Black or Indigenous. As Jen mentioned also, in Nunavut, almost 50% of the population is food insecure. I think it's really important to acknowledge that Nunavut is a place where 86% of the population identifies as First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. Why does being Black or Indigenous mean that we should struggle the most to access food? No one is exempt from the right to food. It applies to all of us. This is racism and anti-indigeneity at work. Again, another government failure. What seems to be a real unwillingness to go beyond PR-inspired, bended knees, while the reality for our communities have been broken promises, delay upon delay, and ignoring these types of systemic inequities. I work at an organization called FoodShare, and recognizing these inequities and the ways that governments have ignored them is one of the things that grounds our work. We acknowledge the harm that's been caused and that exists in our society as a result of these oppressive organizing principles, things like racism, capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, and the way that these things impact who has access to food and who doesn't. Despite the existence of these systemic inequities, FoodShare is guided by the fact that we all have a right to food and that our government needs to do more to respect, protect, and fulfill this right. So what FoodShare does is we work with communities across the city of Toronto to build community-based food infrastructure. And I think this is really important. I could go into more details, but I think this is really important when we think about the commodification of food and how it impedes our access. So here we're developing different types of ways for folks to access food that isn't based on a for-profit model, but based on ensuring that people have access. So the type of community-led or community-run food infrastructure that we help to support are things like urban farms, subsidized community produce markets, and a fresh produce delivery box program called the Good Food Box. And we do this because the right to food, of course, hasn't been actualized. The right to food for everybody hasn't been actualized. Instead, as was mentioned, society and our politicians direct food insecure households often to food banks. And again, the right to food is not about food charity or leftover food. And I want to add maybe one other piece around food banks and why they're so inadequate, and it connects to racism. I spent some time living in Vancouver, and one of the things I wanted to understand when I was living and working in Vancouver was around who uses the food bank there. What are some of the barriers that people find to using the food banks? There's a significant population of low-income Chinese elders in the community that I worked in, the downtown east side. So we engaged, we brought on someone to do some translation, and one of the things, I heard the most incredible story. We were asking a Chinese elder, a woman, why she didn't go to the food bank. And she said, well, I went once, people told me to go. And when I got there, they gave me this box, and inside the box there were some noodles and a powder, some white or some orange powder, and it didn't look like food. I didn't know what to do with it, so I didn't want to eat it. It wasn't something that I could use. One of the things we don't think about in terms of food banks is the food is often Eurocentric and not culturally appropriate for many folks. And I think it's, we live in one of the richest countries in the world. That's something that we shouldn't forget. Treating low-income people like walking compost bins, I don't think is not the answer to this problem. Food banks are not the answer, and I will even go as far to say, and I know this offends people sometimes, but I'll say it anyway, I also don't think that trending food waste diversion schemes have the ability to solve food insecurity, and I think they're problematic in a whole bunch of other ways. I think the biggest is distracting us and confusing us about what the issue is and how we address it. I also acknowledge that the work of FoodShare, and I think that's really important. We need more folks working in this space to acknowledge that, the work of charitable food organizations will not solve food insecurity. No charity should be tasked with protecting our fundamental human rights. None of us have the capacity to do so. So what will it take to solve this issue, and what role can basic income play? I'm coming to that soon, I promise. But first, we can't talk about solutions without, I think, talking about things like white supremacy and white universalism, and how they've informed what has been traditionally positioned as a solution. It's important to understand that historically, the way that we've talked about food insecurity has focused on aggregate data and broad trends. And I think that's the first part of the problem. That approach clumps the particular experiences of those that have been made most vulnerable by our systems, like Black Canadians and Indigenous peoples, with everyone else. And unsurprisingly, there's an appalling lack of research that looks at the interconnections of race and food insecurity. So that's a big part of what inspired FoodShare to partner with a group called Proof out of the University of Toronto, and the lead researcher, Valerie Tarasuk, to try and understand that. We sought to get a better sense of what was happening when it came to Black households across Canada, when it came around food insecurity. And the results of that research have challenged widespread beliefs and commonly held notions about food insecurity. So I'd love to share some of those with you. And the process, maybe, but first of all, the process involved a thorough analysis of the Canadian Community Health Survey from 2005, which is when this data was first collected, to 2014. We looked at survey respondents who were the primary respondent for the household identified as Black. And here's what we learned. So, a couple of things you may expect, a couple of things we expected, and then a few things we absolutely didn't expect and threw us for a pretty significant loop. The first thing we found was that if you live in a Black household in this country, you are 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure than if you live in a white household. We learned that 12% of white children live in food insecure households, while 36% of Black children live in food insecure households. Now, shocking, appalling, and horrific, all of that. I think I was not surprised, terribly surprised by that data. What surprised me was what came after that. So when we've talked about food insecurity in this country, we've often talked about household composition. And when there's a lone parent in a household, it means that there's less income, more likely to be less income, so it's more likely that that household is going to be food insecure. Well, when you look at the experiences specifically of Black Canadians across this land, that is not true. It doesn't matter whether or not it was a single-parent household or a dual-parent household, the risk and prevalence of food insecurity remained high. The same was true around immigration status. It didn't matter whether or not, which is unlike the kind of aggregate narrative in data, or the narrative that comes from the aggregate data, immigration status. It didn't matter whether someone was born in Canada, a Black person was born in Canada, born abroad, how long they had been here, the risk and prevalence remained high. Home ownership was another one. We could imagine that typically if someone owns a home, they are less likely to be food insecure. Certainly not always the case, but less likely to be food insecure. What we actually found was the percentage of Black homeowners that were food insecure in this country, 14.5%, was almost identical to the percentage of white renters that are food insecure at 14.3%. Social assistance. I almost fell out of my chair when I was first hearing about this piece. One of the things that stunned me is in this country, white folks receive more in social assistance than Black folks do. How could that be? You would think, it's a little equation. I always thought there was someone punch in some numbers, out spits an entitlement. But actually we realized pretty quickly that, these figures include disability income supports. So what we're inferring is that Black Canadians are less likely to be approved for disability, which provides more than someone might receive on welfare. And when we are approved for disability, we receive less than white folks do. Another key piece that I think is really important. So many of you may know that there was a basic income pilot in Ontario that was cancelled by the bad-minded, awful, terrible Premier of Ontario. I won't even say his name, but it was cancelled. But for me, and this may be an unpopular opinion, I was less interested in, and quite a few folks that I know were less interested in a pilot, because there is some data out there that already speaks to the impact of basic income. Do we need another pilot? No, we need to move forward with the things that we know are effective. So we know that, seniors, when a low-income senior hits retirement age, when a low-income senior hits retirement age, the risk to food insecurity decreases significantly, by 50%. Why? Because once someone hits retirement age, they have access, in essence, to a basic income through things like the Guaranteed Income Supplement and Old Age Security. The evidence is there, the data is there, kind of, sort of. Because again, through this research, we wanted to understand what was happening for Black Canadians. The same protection didn't exist for Black Canadians. When we hit retirement age, we didn't see that kind of decrease. The risk and the prevalence of food insecurity, again, remained high. So this is one of the reasons why I say it's so important to have these kinds of conversations, not just about racism, but making sure we're paying specific attention to those folks that our systems have made most vulnerable. So ultimately, I could go on about this research, but ultimately our research demonstrates that the overriding factor for the disproportionate experience of food insecurity for Black Canadians is anti-Black racism. So if we're going to tackle food insecurity, we also have to commit to tackling anti-Black racism. It's not a nice to have, it is a thing that informs who has food and who doesn't. And now to basic income. I'll start with saying that I believe basic income is an essential tool to challenge food insecurity. But it can't do it alone. I think many of us understand that. And for me, I actually take a step back, and I think about, I'm less interested in, don't attack me all at once, but I'm less interested in kind of focusing on a guaranteed livable income as a policy tool, as much as I am focused on recognizing that we live in one of the richest countries in the world, and as a framework, we should be thinking about a guaranteed livable country. A framework for a guaranteed livable country should and must include a basic income, should and must include some of the things that Jen spoke about. It should include a commitment to provision of public services, the building the affordable housing that we need, moving forward with pharmacare, introducing a childcare program. When Jen's slide popped up that showed the number of people with higher incomes that are still food insecure, you know, the first thing that jumped out to me, I spent some time the last little while knocking on some doors and having conversations with folks. And one of the things that I heard a lot about was about childcare. And people are paying more for childcare than they are their rent. So as an intervention, developing a universal childcare program is actually one of the ways that we're going to help reduce food insecurity and needs to be part of that fulsome framework, I think, to advance a guaranteed livable country. And I think, you know, in addition to truly go forward in a good way together as a society, we also need to genuinely acknowledge the harm that white supremacy has caused and continues to cause, which means acknowledging the generations of health inequities and the genocide that's been perpetuated on this land and that continues to be perpetuated. Basic income and even building all of the housing that's needed without real restitution, like reparations or land back, is simply a go-forward approach. And I underscore this and highlight this because I think it's really important. When some of us think about our privilege and positionality in society, it's easier for some to think about a go-forward approach if you haven't lived the harm, the generational harm caused by these inequities. So in order for us to move forward in a good way with things like basic income, with a more robust framework for a guaranteed livable country, we also need to make sure that there is some real and meaningful restitution for the ways that those inequities and those injustices have harmed communities across this land. Land back, reparations should be important parts of these conversations as well. And I often think when we're solely focused on a go-forward approach, you know, that to me tells me a lot about who's in the room or who's leading the process of trying to get our lived experiences to fit into a policy box or a policy window. But it just doesn't work like that. A policy window isn't going to save us. I think it's time to start thinking like my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my mother taught me all those years ago, that we have a responsibility to one another. While capitalism teaches us that we're in competition with one another, mutual aid teaches us that we need to look out for each other. Can you imagine if our governments applied principles of mutual aid and the protection of our human rights to governing? That's what the social contract should be about. So it's time to do more than imagine that special land without poverty and food insecurity and without homelessness. It's time for us to go there. So let's go there. Let's make these things happen. Like I said, it is absolutely possible. Thank you so much. All right.
That was beautiful.
Thank you. I think there's some questions.
That was beautiful. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time. So we're not going to do back and forth probably, but why don't we take a couple of questions from the floor or online? And before we take any questions, I just want to say thank you for that coffee. Thank you. That was really good.
My point was, well, you know what my point was. I know it.
I'm also very grateful.
But really, I wanted to say a thank you more than Paul did.
Thanks again.
You're very welcome.
Are there any questions? We can take two questions. Did you have a question? I thought I saw your hand. Where? Anna.
Paul, I was interested in what you said about Black seniors, because I'm familiar with the trend of people on social assistance. When they become seniors, their income generally goes up, and then, it's like a party for a little while. And not a party, but you know what I mean? Like it's a happy thing. And you said that wasn't true of Black seniors, and that and you attribute it to racism. And I wonder how that racism, what it looks like. And I wonder if it's like to do with living in a food desert, taking care of younger people who might not have enough income. Like whether you have any sort of ideas about how that manifests, that racism manifests, and whether that's important in looking at this?
That's a great question. And I guess the first thing I'll say is the research doesn't tell us that. So anything that I offer would be an inference. The research is really specific just around what's happening, but doesn't get into that level of detail. So I would say, the first question was, does it have to do with food deserts? I would say no, and I would encourage us all to disavow ourselves of the kind of thinking around food deserts that many of us have been told. Low-income people, there's no research that suggests that living in a food desert has an impact on food insecurity. Low-income people, and from personal experience, we're used to traveling great distances to access deals and go to different places to pick up our groceries. So I'm more interested in conversations less about food deserts and more about food mirages. So I think often we live in places where there may be fresh food, but we can't afford it, so it's not accessible to us, so it becomes a mirage. So what's happening specifically for Black seniors? Again, I can't really say, but my guesses are, when you start to be able to draw upon things like your retirement savings, if you've had low-wage work, if you have cared for dependents, or still caring for dependents, as you acknowledged, when you become a senior, those things take away from your ability to access food as a senior. So those are just kind of maybe some thoughts, but again, the research doesn't speak to that. But great question.